June 7, 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy trembled beneath the weight of gunfire and summer rain. Smoke clung low to the earth, a drifting curtain through which scattered German infantry searched the bodies of fallen Americans. The ground was littered with torn ration packs, crumpled letters, and the glint of strange metal. Then came a sound, faint, singular, unmistakable, ping. A high, metallic note that rose from the mud like a ghost. Lieutenant Karl Brenner froze. It was the sound he had heard hours earlier in the chaos of battle, that same metallic ring, followed by a rapid, unbroken rhythm of shots that had cut through his platoon like a sewing machine tearing cloth. Now, standing amid the wreckage of helmets and gear, he traced the sound to a rifle lying half-buried in earth. Sleek, balanced, and heavier than any German carbine, its wooden stock bore the mark U.S. Rifle Cal 30 M1 Springfield Armory. He turned it over in his hands. No bolt to cycle, no familiar rhythm of single fire and reload. It was different, alive, almost mechanical in its intent. The weapon seemed to breathe efficiency. Brenner lifted it, peered down the sights, and pressed the trigger. The empty chamber clicked, and the spent clip sprang from the top with that same metallic ping. A small, simple sound, yet it carried the echo of something vast. Nearby, a sergeant muttered, "They all have these?" Brenner nodded slowly. Around them, their comrades examined other captured rifles, murmuring disbelief. The Americans were not carrying the usual slow, bolt-action weapons of an ordinary infantry army. They were carrying the pace of an assembly line. Every man armed with the precision of industry itself. Later that night, under the dim light of a half-destroyed farmhouse, Brenner handed the Garand to his superior. The officer turned it in silence, his fingers tracing the fine machining, the balance, the relentless logic of its design. "This," he said finally, "is not a soldier's rifle. It is a factory's rifle." Outside, the rain thickened, drumming against the roof with the same rhythm that had haunted them all day. The rhythm of a weapon built by a nation that manufactured speed. Before we move deeper into this forgotten story, subscribe to POW Tales, where real history speaks. And in the morning, when German intelligence officers gathered the captured weapons for inspection, the truth began to dawn. The Americans were fighting a war, measured not by courage or tactics, but by tempo. The context begins with that discovery and what it revealed about the world behind the trigger. The discovery of the M1 Garand in the hedgerows of Normandy did more than unsettle a few German platoons. It forced the Wehrmacht to confront the scale of an industrial war they had underestimated. The Americans, once dismissed as soft civilians with too many machines, had turned their manufacturing genius into a doctrine of firepower. For every German rifleman trained for precision, there were now 10 Americans trained for velocity. By the summer of 1944, over 4 million M1 Garands had rolled out of Springfield Armory in Massachusetts and Winchester Repeating Arms in Connecticut. Inside those vast factory halls, women in headscarves and men too old for combat worked 12-hour shifts beneath the thrum of belt-driven conveyors. War Department inspectors walked the aisles with clipboards, timing the rhythm of assembly as if synchronizing a symphony. The sound was mechanical but strangely alive. The clatter of bolts, the hiss of oil, the press of machines that forged barrels by the thousands. The Garand was not just a rifle. It was the distilled essence of American production. Reliable, efficient, repeatable. General George S. Patton called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. and in the small arms offices of Berlin, the phrase would later appear in intercepted US reports, annotated with irritation and disbelief. German engineers at Mauserwerke had tried for years to create a semi-automatic infantry rifle that could survive the mud and chaos of battle. The Americans had done it quietly, without fanfare, and had armed nearly every soldier with one. Within days of D-Day, captured Garands began appearing in the inventory lists of Heereswaffenamt Gruppe II, the German Army's ordnance evaluation branch. Reports collected by field inspectors described the weapon's gas-operated system, its 8-round N-block clip, and its uncanny durability. A June 10th memorandum, later declassified, noted, "The American infantry possesses fire superiority even at the platoon level. Their rifle permits continuous, rapid engagement with minimal training." The contrast with German doctrine was stark. The Wehrmacht had built its infantry tactics around the Karabiner 98K, a finely machined but slow bolt-action rifle, a weapon designed for an army that prized marksmanship over mass. Yet here, in the muddy lanes of Normandy, those assumptions collapsed under the sheer mechanical rhythm of American fire. Every engagement felt different. The battlefield now had a tempo, an industrial pulse that seemed to multiply with every shot. For the German command, this was more than a tactical surprise. It was a cultural one. Reports filtered upward to Army Group B headquarters, where General Hans Speidel read the summaries with a mix of disbelief and quiet dread. The Americans, it seemed, had achieved what German engineers had declared impractical, a soldier's weapon that behaved like a machine tool. The implications rippled through the high command. Field Marshal Rommel himself, in a late June briefing, reportedly commented that the enemy fights with the logic of a factory. The phrase appeared again, weeks later, in a captured notebook from an American officer where the same logic was reversed. The Germans fight like craftsmen. We fight like manufacturers. In the prisoner cages along the coast, American captives often heard their interrogators ask a single recurring question. How many rifles do you have? The Germans couldn't believe that every infantryman carried a semi-automatic weapon. It contradicted every assumption they'd made about Allied production capacity. The truth, as later revealed in U.S. War Department memoranda, was that by 1943, the United States had reached a point where industrial efficiency itself had become a weapon. Even the smallest parts of the Garand, the machined op rod, the stamped trigger guard, reflected a philosophy alien to German design. Where Germany sought perfection through precision, America sought strength through repetition. The result was a rifle that didn't need to be perfect, only plentiful and predictable. In the cold logic of war, that distinction mattered more than artistry. It meant that while Germany was fighting a battle of skill, America was fighting a battle of systems. That battle was about to become visible not just in reports and numbers, but in the eyes of German soldiers who would soon face the Garand's relentless rhythm firsthand. By July 1944, fragments of captured Garands had already reached testing benches inside Germany. In a secure facility near Kummersdorf, engineers of the Heereswaffenamt disassembled the rifles under the scrutiny of officers from the OKW's technical division. The reports that followed were almost reluctant in tone, the kind of praise that carried the sting of humiliation. The rifle's semi-automatic action is of remarkable reliability, one document read. Its simplicity of manufacture belies its sophistication of function. For an army accustomed to viewing technology as a matter of craftsmanship, not mass output, this was almost heresy. Within the Wehrmacht's internal correspondence, phrases began to appear that bordered on reverence. One colonel described the Garand as a product of an industrial organism operating at full consciousness. Another referred to it as a weapon born of electricity and conveyor belts. To the German mind, trained to think of weapons as expressions of skill and tradition, the American rifle was something alien, an instrument of democracy's assembly lines, indifferent to artistry, devoted only to endurance. The shock extended beyond the technical. War Department memoranda, later declassified, show that the U.S. Office of War Information had understood the psychological potential of showcasing American industrial superiority. In their propaganda, leaflets dropped over Europe, subtle hints were embedded, phrases like "every soldier, a factory of fire," and "the rifle that never waits." These were not empty boasts. Behind each phrase stood an economy that could produce 500,000 rifles in the time Germany could build 50,000. Inside the German camp system, intelligence officers questioned captured GIs relentlessly about production methods. How long to make one of these rifles, they asked. Where are they built? How do you train so many men? The prisoners' answers, often uncertain, sometimes deliberately misleading, only deepened the mystery. The notion that the United States could sustain that rhythm of manufacture while fighting a two-ocean war seemed, to the Germans, an absurdity bordering on magic. In contrast, the Americans saw no miracle at all. Factory workers at Springfield and Winchester thought of the Garand as just another part number, another shift's output. A woman named Lillian Carter, whose letters survive in the archives of the Smithsonian, wrote to her brother at the front, "They say the rifle you carry might be one I helped clean before inspection. Funny to think my hands might have touched something that keeps you alive." That quiet intimacy between anonymous worker and anonymous soldier was something the German system, rooted in hierarchy and division, could never replicate. As the Allies pushed inland from the beaches, the tempo of battle began to mirror the tempo of industry. German field reports noted that American infantry advanced as if guided by metronome. A squad could lay down sustained fire without the pauses that defined traditional warfare. To the men on the receiving end, it felt less like combat and more like machinery grinding forward. At Army Group B headquarters, staff officers compiled intelligence briefs filled with excerpts from interrogations, captured leaflets, and field analyses. A section marked "Enemy Infantry Equipment" concluded with an unsettling observation. The Americans have turned the individual rifleman into an extension of their factory. Each man is a production line of fire. That phrase circulated quietly among officers in the weeks before Saint-Lô, eventually reaching Rommel himself. Rommel's aide-de-camp later wrote in his post-war memoirs that the field marshal had stood silently after reading the report, then said, "They fight with abundance, not just courage. How can one resist a nation that makes plenty its weapon?" Behind those words lay the central revelation of the Normandy campaign, that America's power was not only in numbers, but in rhythm, a rhythm of fire born from rhythm of production. And for the Germans who faced it, that rhythm would soon become inescapable, not just in the weapons they captured, but in the way the war itself began to sound. The next part begins where theory ends, when the Garand's rhythm met the battlefield's chaos. July 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy had become killing fields of mud and echo. To move even 10 meters meant crawling through a tangle of nettles and barbed wire while mortars shrieked overhead. German platoons, exhausted, and disoriented, waited for the familiar pattern of combat, the pause between shots that allowed them to breathe, reload, reposition. But the Americans gave them none. The air itself seemed to vibrate with unbroken rhythm. 8 sharp cracks, a metallic ping, and then the rhythm began again. For Lieutenant Karl Brenner, who had first handled the captured Garand weeks earlier, the rifle's voice now haunted every engagement. His men spoke of it as if it were a living thing. "It fires like it never tires," one soldier whispered. After a skirmish near Saint-Lô, they had grown up believing that man was the heart of battle, that courage, precision, and willpower decided victory. Yet in these hedgerows, courage met something colder, a mechanical certainty. The Americans fired faster, reloaded faster, advanced faster. At dusk, when the fog rolled in and muffled the world, Brenner could still hear the rhythm. He described it later in a field letter recovered from a destroyed command post. The enemy's fire comes not from individuals, but from a single machine stretched across the field. It breathes. The phrasing, poetic and resigned, mirrored the growing realization among the German ranks that they were no longer fighting men. They were fighting an industrial tempo given form. In nearby command dugouts, the situation reports told the same story. At 7th Army headquarters, staff officers noted that small unit encounters increasingly ended with entire German squads pinned down by intense semi-automatic fire before armor or artillery could intervene. A captured American sergeant, interrogated near Coutances, explained that every rifleman could cover his own sector without waiting for orders. To German officers trained in tightly controlled fire discipline, this autonomy was both alien and terrifying. The motif of rhythm, that pulse of mechanical fire, began to infect German communications. Radio operators described waves of continuous bursts. The battlefield had become a percussion chamber, each Garand's report overlapping another until the distinction between individual and machine disappeared. By late July, the Americans were pushing toward Avranches, and the once proud German infantry companies were reduced to skeletal remnants. "Our rifles feel old," one soldier wrote in a diary found near Mortain. "Each shot feels like it belongs to another century." Even the weather seemed to conspire with the tempo of the enemy. Summer storms turned fields into mirrors of mud, amplifying each gunshot's echo. To German soldiers entrenched among the hedges, the sound was disorienting, fire coming from everywhere, from nowhere. The ping of empty clips sang faintly over the din, like a factory whistle, calling shifts to work. In moments of quiet, Brenner thought back to the farmhouse where he had first examined the Garand. He remembered the rain tapping on the roof, steady and rhythmic, and how he had mistaken it for the sound of distant rifles. Now, in battle, the sounds were indistinguishable. Nature itself seemed to mimic the Americans' cadence. At night, when the front fell silent, he gathered his platoon and tried to steady them with talk of discipline, of training, of courage. But his words fell thin in the dark. His men stared at the black sky, listening to the mechanical thunder that would begin again at dawn. And in that darkness, Brenner realized the most terrifying truth of all. The Americans weren't merely better armed, they were better synchronized. Each man was part of a vast, unseen factory that extended from the hedgerows back to the assembly lines of Springfield. The war, he thought, had ceased to be human. In early August, as the German front reeled from the Allied breakout at Saint-Lô, the collapse took on a sound before it took on a shape. The steady, unrelenting tempo of Garand fire became the pulse of the Allied advance. Every engagement began with that rhythm, sharp, precise, overlapping, until even German officers could recognize it from miles away. To the weary, it sounded like the hammering of an invisible forge, reshaping the battlefield in real time. In one of the last functioning command posts near Weir, reports piled up describing encounters with automatic infantry. The term was wrong, but it captured the feeling of facing a force whose fire never paused. Major Erich von Riedel, an ordnance officer attached to Panzer Division, wrote in his field journal, "The Americans are fighting like engineers. Their discipline is not of the parade ground, but of production. Their weapon teaches the hand to follow the machine." The distinction haunted him. In the old Prussian manuals, the soldier was the craftsman. He aimed, fired, adjusted, and repeated, each motion guided by thought. The Garand erased that sequence. It allowed instinct to merge with mechanism, turning the act of firing into a seamless continuation of motion. It was the difference between a violin and a piano. The Garand played itself, and the tune was war. In August, as the Falaise pocket began to close, German troops were cut off in mazes of smoke and dust. Amid the confusion, some scavenged captured Garands from fallen Americans, desperate to match fire with fire. They learned quickly how to load the 8-round clip, how to feel for the subtle click before the bolt slammed forward. But their ammunition was scarce, and their commanders forbade its use. To fire an enemy weapon, one sergeant warned, is to confess defeat. Yet by then, defeat had already begun to write its own doctrine. Outside Trun, Brenner's unit was reduced to half strength. They fought for hours in apple orchards under the constant din of semi-automatic fire. Each sound felt closer now, personal, the ping of ejected clips mingling with the rasp of breath and the crunch of boots in mud. The rhythm had become part of them, not just a threat, but a presence. It was the industrial heartbeat of an army built to never slow down. When the order to retreat came, the roads were already clogged with burning vehicles. Artillery thunder mixed with the rhythm of Garand volleys, forming a single mechanical roar. Brenner, crouched behind a wall, wrote one last line in his notebook before fleeing. "Their rifles sing the anthem of the factory. We have no answer to it." That notebook, later recovered from a captured truck near Argenton, ended mid-sentence. The last line trailed into nothing but mud stains. Historians who studied it, decades later, in Bundesarchiv Koblenz, found the pages brittle and faintly marked by oil, a residue that matched American rifle lubricant. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. The imprint of one nation's machinery on another's defeat. Meanwhile, back at German Ordnance headquarters in Berlin, the first analytical reports on the Normandy fighting arrived. They confirmed what field officers already knew, that the American semi-automatic rifle had transformed the dynamics of infantry combat. "We have underestimated the enemy's capacity to industrialize the battlefield," one report concluded. Another added grimly, "Our craftsmanship cannot compete with their production." That was the dissent, not just of armies, but of an idea that perfection could withstand abundance. The German faith in precision and artistry was crumbling against the sheer speed of American manufacture. Every ping, every burst, every motion of the Garand told them the same story, that the new war belonged to those who built faster, not finer. And in the chaos of retreat, even the proudest German officers began to whisper a truth that could not be put in reports, that the sound of the Garand was not merely a weapon's echo, but the mechanical voice of an empire in motion. The next chapter begins not in chaos, but in endurance. The slow, grinding rhythm of daily survival that followed. By September 1944, the front lines had fractured into a weary rhythm of advance and withdrawal, and captivity began to feel less like a possibility and more like an inevitability. For those who survived the collapse in Normandy and the drive across France, the days stretched into a monotonous sequence of exhaustion. The sound of the M1 Garand no longer haunted the nights. It became part of the silence between them. In makeshift camps behind the German lines, captured American weapons were now stacked in guarded piles, objects of both fascination and resentment. Brenner, reassigned to a rear logistics unit after losing most of his platoon, found himself among the soldiers tasked with cataloguing these captured rifles. He wrote in his diary that the work feels like counting the teeth of a machine that has already devoured us. Each day followed the same script. Men lined up for bread that tasted of sawdust, coffee stretched with roasted barley, and thin stew. Overhead, the drone of Allied bombers filled the air with a low hum that seemed to vibrate in their bones. Yet among the monotony, something curious persisted, a kind of grim admiration for the enemy's weapons. When officers weren't watching, soldiers would pass around a Garand, cycle its action, and marvel at the smoothness of its mechanism. "It feels like it forgives your mistakes," one private murmured. The propaganda office back in Berlin tried to counter this fascination. Articles in Die Wehrmacht magazine described the Garand as a weapon for untrained masses, claiming it wasted ammunition and encouraged recklessness. But the men who had faced it knew better. They had seen the efficiency, the precision in its simplicity. The rifle did not waste. It accelerated. As autumn deepened, routine became the only defense against despair. Units rotated through supply depots, filling wagons with what little fuel and ammunition remained. Rumors of a new German automatic rifle, the Sturmgewehr 44, circulated through the ranks, a supposed answer to the American semi-automatic advantage. Brenner finally saw one in October. It looked brutal and efficient, but crude, as if desperation had shaped it. When he fired it for the first time, he admitted in his notes, "It bites harder than the Garand, but without grace. The American's rifle feels built for an army that believes it will live. Ours feels built for one that knows it will die." The days passed under a sky of endless grey. Winter approached, and the fields turned to ice. Soldiers repaired boots with wire, patched uniforms with curtain cloth, and burned engine oil to stay warm. The Garand rifles, locked away in crates marked Erbutet USA, became relics of another world, a world of abundance. Some joked that if they ever lost the war, they would gladly surrender to a country capable of building such machines. The joke was never repeated twice. In November, when Allied leaflets began falling over their positions, images of captured German soldiers eating full rations in POW camps, a quiet envy spread. The leaflets showed prisoners smiling with cigarettes and warm coats. "Propaganda," said the officers. But in the stillness of the nights, men stared at the pictures and thought of the rifles again, how those same rifles had brought them to this point. The monotony of those days, the small rituals of repair and reflection, turned survival into a kind of surrender. The war was still being fought, but its meaning was dissolving. And for Brenner, who once admired the elegance of German engineering, the realization came slowly that the Garand was not just a rifle, but a philosophy. It represented a nation that had turned abundance into power. And that philosophy, as winter closed in, began to haunt his dreams more than the rifle's sound ever had. The second half of Routine takes us into captivity, where monotony found its mirror behind American fences. By January 1945, the monotony Brenner had once observed in rear depots returned in another form, the rhythm of captivity. His unit, encircled near the Sour River during the Ardennes retreat, surrendered after 2 days without ammunition. The men were exhausted, their rifles, German and captured alike, stacked in silent surrender. The last weapon Brenner touched before capture was an M1 Garand. He handed it to an American infantryman who inspected it briefly, nodded once, and slung it over his shoulder with casual ease. That motion, smooth and practiced, etched itself into Brenner's mind, efficiency made human. The POW column trudged westward through mud and frost toward a temporary enclosure outside Luxembourg. At first, the prisoners walked in silence, too drained to speak, but as they passed American supply convoys and field hospitals, their eyes widened. Wooden crates labeled Medical U.S. Army stood in endless rows, trucks overflowed with blankets, canned goods, and tools. Even the guards seemed indifferent to scarcity. When one of them tossed a cigarette to a prisoner, the gesture carried no weight, just the ease of men who had more than enough. Inside the wire, the routine began again. Roll call, ration line, fatigue duty. But this time, monotony came with warmth, shelter, and something that felt almost alien, adequacy. Each man received wool blankets, medical checkups, and food that, though bland, arrived regularly. The contrast gnawed at them. We were treated by the enemy with the care we could not give our own, Brenner later wrote in his post-war memoir. They fed us, examined us, and allowed us to live in a world that functioned. Every day, as Brenner and the others were marched past American depots, the same sound echoed faintly, the metallic ping of Garands being cleaned. The rifles were everywhere, in the hands of guards, stacked outside barracks, resting casually against sandbags. It became a kind of background music to captivity, the sound of order maintained by machinery. For the German officers, it was both humiliating and mesmerizing. They had spent years mastering the art of precision, yet here they were, prisoners of an army whose strength lay in abundance. Letters home, carefully censored by the camp authorities, began to echo this tone of stunned observation. Their army is not built on discipline, but on supply, wrote one colonel to his wife. Even their rifles feel manufactured by confidence. Such letters, preserved in archives decades later, captured the psychological drift that had begun in Normandy and now completed itself behind barbed wire. The admiration had become acceptance. The Americans, for their part, treated their prisoners with a blend of practicality and procedure. Medical officers noted the malnutrition among German captives and prescribed vitamin supplements. Clerks issued Red Cross parcels and books. Brenner noticed the handwriting on one such package, Springfield Armory, and thought of the rifle again. It felt as if the same factories that had armed his enemy were now sustaining his survival. Over weeks, life in the camp settled into a predictable rhythm. Morning inspections, meals, work details, letters, and silence. The days lost distinction. Yet something subtle had changed. The prisoners no longer discussed victory or tactics. Instead, they spoke of systems, of how an army could move food, ammunition, and medicine with such precision across oceans. The American war machine, once dismissed as crude materialism, now appeared to them as a kind of moral order, not born of ideology, but of logistics. One evening, as Brenner walked the perimeter, he heard an American guard explaining his rifle to another, how to field strip it, clean the gas port, and reassemble it blindfolded. The words carried across the winter air, not boastful, just instructional, routine. Brenner listened, smiling faintly. That sound, the language of familiarity, of a weapon treated as extension rather than burden, became, to him, the defining rhythm of captivity. The war outside still raged, but inside the camp, another transformation was taking place, the surrender of ideology to pragmatism, of pride to comprehension. And when the spring thaw came, bringing with it the rumors of Germany's collapse, Brenner realized something profound, that the real weapon America had unleashed was not the Garand itself, but the civilization that could build one without fear of waste. That realization leads to a different kind of confrontation, not with enemy fire, but with truth itself. Spring, 1945. The thaw came slowly that year. Muddy fields, thawing roofs, and the faint smell of oil from American trucks parked beyond the barbed wire. News filtered through the camp in whispers. Berlin surrounded, Hitler dead, the Reich collapsing. For most of the German prisoners, these were not moments of shock, but of quiet recognition. The sound of the Garand, once a symbol of terror, had faded into memory, replaced by the soft thud of baseballs in the distance, the laughter of American guards killing time. For Karl Brenner, the true turning point did not come with the war's end, but with a lecture. One morning, the camp commandant announced that officers would be required to attend educational sessions, part of a new Allied program to reorient German POWs toward democratic values. The lectures took place in a makeshift hall converted from a storage tent, its canvas walls fluttering with the early breeze. On the first day, an American colonel stood before them holding something unexpected, an M1 Garand. It gleamed under the weak sunlight, polished, oiled, and precise. This, the colonel began, won the war more than any speech or slogan. He spoke not as a soldier, but as a manufacturer, explaining how this rifle was built not by artisans, but by process, interchangeable parts, automated inspection, quality without individuality. It's not perfect, he admitted, but it's perfect enough, and it can be made 1,000,000 times over. The officers watched in silence. Some bristled, others stared. Brenner listened with the strange calm of recognition. The colonel continued, describing how factories in Massachusetts, Illinois, and Ohio had turned out rifles day and night without pause. Women assembled them, teenagers inspected them, and soldiers carried them, each part indistinguishable from the next. That's America, he said simply. We build things so fast, even our mistakes can't catch up. Afterward, Brenner was handed a copy of a magazine, Life, dated February 1945. Inside, a photograph spread showed rows of workers at Springfield Armory, smiling beneath banners that read, "Every rifle counts." The machinery, the faces, the endless repetition, it all felt like a mirror image of the ideology he had once served, only inverted. Germany had exalted mastery. America had exalted momentum. One built for precision, the other for proliferation. That night, Brenner sat in his bunk long after lights out, staring at the magazine under a flickering bulb. The image of a young woman tightening a rifle's gas cylinder lingered in his mind. She looked ordinary, cheerful, unaware that her hands had shaped the tool that had undone an army. A weapon built by someone who never saw the front. he wrote in his journal, yet who won it nonetheless. Days later, another lecture followed, this time on the American economy. Charts, photographs, and even a film reel projected onto a hanging sheet showed assembly lines moving with a speed that seemed inhuman. Ford plants producing trucks by the minute, Remington arms packaged in synchronized rhythm, medical supplies, canned food, boots, everything feeding the front like arteries from an industrial heart. It was not triumphalist propaganda. It was demonstration, quiet, factual, and devastating. The officers left in silence, many shaken not by defeat, but by the revelation that the enemy's power came not from brutality or ambition, but from order, the kind of order that could build a weapon so efficient it freed the soldier from thinking, allowing him simply to move. That realization that a rifle could symbolize a nation's identity reshaped Brenner's understanding of the war. For the first time, he saw the Garand not as a machine of death, but as a blueprint of democracy. Every interchangeable part was a statement. No piece more important than another, each replaceable, yet essential. It was the political philosophy of a republic forged into steel. And as he lay awake that night, listening to the faint ping of a guard's rifle outside, Brenner began to sense the first stirrings of an idea that would outlive the war, that a weapon could change not just battles, but beliefs. Weeks passed, and the lectures continued. The camp transformed subtly, guards more relaxed, prisoners quieter, and the air thick with something unspoken, reflection. One morning, an American instructor brought a small group of POW officers, Brenner among them, to a nearby ordnance depot for a demonstration of procedure. What awaited them was not a display of power, but of principle. Inside a vast warehouse outside Reims, sunlight poured through glass skylights onto orderly rows of machinery. Civilians, women mostly, moved among the workbenches, assembling, repairing, and testing rifles. There was no shouting, no whip of command. Instead, there was rhythm. Each worker knew their motion, as if it were part of a symphony. Slide, align, lock, test, pass. A conveyor belt carried components down the line, where hands reached out instinctively, completing their portion and letting the next take over. Brenner watched, transfixed. "They are not soldiers," he murmured to himself, "but they have discipline." He remembered Berlin's factories before the war, the constant barking of overseers, the air of fear that drove production. Here, there was no fear, only purpose. The rifles that emerged from this harmony were not trophies. They were tools, built without hate. An officer from the U.S. Ordnance Corps, noticing his gaze, explained softly, "Every rifle we make is the same, because no one person owns it. We build them so that anyone, anywhere, can fight tyranny. That's the point." The words struck him harder than any weapon. Anyone, anywhere. The German engineer in him understood the mechanical truth. The prisoner understood the human one. For years he had believed that mastery came from hierarchy, that greatness required obedience. But here, in this warehouse, filled with the hum of machines and laughter of workers, he saw another truth. Freedom could be industrial. That evening, back in camp, Brenner gathered with fellow officers in the barracks. They spoke quietly about what they had witnessed. One, a colonel from Hamburg, whispered, "We were beaten, not by numbers, but by method." Another replied, "No, by belief, theirs in progress, ours in perfection." The symbolic motif of the Garand returned in every conversation. It was no longer an instrument of humiliation, but of revelation. To some, it represented the end of German arrogance. To others, a bridge towards something new. "It fires without pause," Brenner said one night, "because it trusts the man behind it. Our rifles never did." The others nodded. They had spent their lives serving machinery that demanded reverence, not trust. By the time word of Germany's unconditional surrender reached them, the transformation was complete. There were no cheers, no defiance, only quiet exhalation. The war that had begun in ideals ended in mechanisms. In the following weeks, the Americans began showing newsreels. Images of liberated Paris, soldiers embracing civilians, and victory parades through cities that still shimmered under the fresh paint of renewal. The rifles were there too, slung over shoulders, symbols of a world already moving on. Brenner watched these images with a detached calm. The Garand, he realized, had not only ended the war on the battlefield, but had defined what would come after it. Its philosophy, efficiency over excess, equality over distinction, was now the architecture of the post-war world. He felt no resentment, only awe and a quiet sense of mourning for the civilization that had prized art over function and lost both. In his final camp entry before repatriation, Brenner wrote, "The weapon that defeated us was not aimed by hatred, but built by reason. We fought men who trusted their factories more than their flags, and they were right to." When the camp gates finally opened, and the prisoners marched toward transport trains, the guards stood at ease, Garands slung over their shoulders. The metallic ring of an ejected clip echoed one last time across the yard, sharp, clear, and final. For Brenner, that sound no longer symbolized defeat. It marked awakening. The story now moves toward its resolution, when liberation comes and the rifle's echo follows the prisoners home. May 1945. The war had ended, though the word peace still felt foreign. Across the French countryside, POW camps filled with thousands of weary German soldiers, the remains of a defeated empire now scattered in neat rows behind barbed wire. The air smelled of spring, rain, and diesel, and over it drifted the hum of American trucks ferrying supplies east toward occupied Germany. The machine that had won the war was already rebuilding what it had destroyed. At Camp Chaloy, Brenner awoke to a sound that had become strangely comforting, the crack and ping of Garands from the firing range beyond the fence. American soldiers trained daily, the rifles ringing in perfect tempo. "Their war is finished," he noted in his journal, "yet their preparation continues. They live as if conflict were merely another task to refine." For the prisoners, daily life softened. They worked clearing debris, repairing roads, and unloading trucks. The Americans treated them with a professionalism that felt almost detached. One guard, a young sergeant from Ohio, often shared coffee with Brenner after shifts. His name was Miller. He was 19, younger than most of the men he guarded, and carried his Garand with a casual familiarity that fascinated Brenner. One afternoon, while they waited out a rain shower under a supply awning, Brenner asked, "Do you ever think about it, the rifle, what it means?" Miller smiled faintly. "It means I go home. That's all." He sipped from his tin mug. "You build enough of them, no one can stop you from going home." That answer lingered. It was not pride or ideology, just practicality, the kind that had built the rifle, fought the war, and now carried its survivors toward peace. Brenner realized that for Americans, the Garand was never a symbol of conquest. It was continuity, a tool to make survival routine. Weeks later, orders came for repatriation. Trucks arrived to take groups of officers eastward into occupied Germany. As Brenner climbed aboard, he turned once more toward the camp and the faint, rhythmic echo of rifles. He thought of the countless hands that had built them, factory workers, machinists, engineers, and how each had unknowingly reshaped his own life. The convoy rolled through the countryside, past towns scarred but already stirring back to life. In one village, American engineers were repairing a bridge with German laborers under their supervision. The sight struck Brenner deeply. The defeated building alongside the victors, steel meeting steel, function before pride. It was the Garand's philosophy made visible, precision giving way to pragmatism. When they reached the border, the prisoners were transferred to British custody. The guards there were courteous but distant. Their rifles were Lee Enfields, heavy, deliberate, and old-fashioned. Brenner noticed immediately the absence of rhythm, the slow cycle of bolt and cartridge. He realized then how instinctively he had begun to associate the Garand's tempo with modernity itself. The British rifles seemed like echoes from an older age. The final train ride into Germany was silent. The men gazed through cracked windows at their homeland, ruins upon ruins, blackened shells of cities, rails twisted like melted wire. Smoke rose from every horizon. "We built for glory," someone muttered, "and built nothing that lasted." Brenner said nothing. In his mind, he heard again the metallic ping, not of defeat, but of persistence. Crossing into what was left of the Reich, the men were processed at an Allied reception camp near Kassel. There, American officers conducted interviews and health inspections. On the table beside the registration line sat a single Garand rifle, its serial number polished clean. It served no purpose now except presence, an artifact of the world that had ended and the one beginning anew. When Brenner reached the table, the officer glanced at his file and said, "You're an engineer, right? Maybe you'll help rebuild your country this time." The tone was not cruel, just matter of fact. Brenner nodded. "If we do," he replied quietly, "it will sound like that rifle." The officer smiled, perhaps not understanding. But to Brenner, the meaning was clear. Rebuild, not from ideology, but from function, not for conquest, but for continuity. And as he stepped from the registration tent into the cold German air, the echo of that sound seemed to follow him, lingering in the ruins like a rhythm, waiting to begin again. The second half of Collapse of Liberation follows Brenner's return home, and the moment when the rifle's echo meets the silence of a shattered nation. The train that carried Brenner and the others deeper into Germany rattled across a landscape of ghosts. Charred churches, splintered rail yards, and skeletal factories passed by like a film reel stripped of color. In every direction, ruins stretched into the horizon, the architecture of ambition undone by its own perfectionism. Yet amid the desolation, Brenner noticed something unexpected. Cranes moving, smoke from furnaces, men clearing rubble in disciplined rows. Germany was already beginning to rebuild. The rhythm that had destroyed it was now reborn in reconstruction. At Kassel, the prisoners were divided by trade. Brenner, listed as a mechanical engineer, was sent to assist a British-American restoration unit assigned to restart a small arms workshop in Hesse. There, under tarpaulin roofs and broken windows, he found the faint hum of machines again. Lathes salvaged from bombed-out factories, presses oiled back into function. The task was not to make weapons, but to recondition tools, restore turbines, and repair precision gauges for civilian industry. One day, while aligning a measuring spindle, he heard a voice behind him, an American officer overseeing the project. "You know," the officer said, "your designs weren't bad, just aimed in the wrong direction." Brenner looked up, unsure whether to smile. "Ours were made for pride," he replied. "Yours were made for use." The officer nodded. "And that's why ours kept working." The exchange stayed with him. Each day as he handled steel, he thought of that phrase, "made for use." It had become his quiet creed. The rifle that had once humiliated him now guided his hand, as he shaped parts not for destruction, but for repair. The rhythmic press of machinery echoed faintly like the Garand's steady pulse. No longer an enemy's heartbeat, but a metronome for renewal. By autumn, Germany's cities had begun to hum again, with low, mechanical energy. Trains rolled on repaired tracks, lights flickered in reconnected grids, and factories reopened under Allied supervision. To many, the sight of American-made equipment and spare parts was a bitter reminder of defeat. To Brenner, it was instruction. "They rebuilt us with the same precision they fought us," he wrote. "It is not mercy, it is method." One afternoon, an American technical officer visited their workshop carrying something wrapped in cloth. He laid it on the bench and unrolled it. An M1 Garand, clean, oiled, almost ceremonial. "This one came from Normandy," he said. "Thought you'd want to see what became of it." Brenner ran his fingers along the wood, tracing the Springfield stamp. "I remember," he whispered. "This sound ended our war." The officer handed him an empty clip. Brenner slid it in. The mechanism locked with perfect ease. Then, as he pressed the release, the familiar ping echoed softly through the quiet shop. Everyone paused, Germans and Americans alike. The sound, once sharp with violence, now rang like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. "Beautiful," murmured one machinist. "Yes," Brenner said, "because it works." In that moment, he understood fully what he had begun to sense in captivity, that the Garand was not merely a rifle, but a covenant between man and mechanism. It demanded trust, not worship. It symbolized a system where precision served purpose, not pride. Months later, as he prepared to return home to Stuttgart, Brenner carried with him a single keepsake, a brass cartridge casing from that demonstration, polished until it gleamed like gold. He kept it in his coat pocket during the train ride, turning it over in his hand like a rosary bead. The rhythm of the train wheels against the rails sounded almost like the rifle's cadence, the steady, mechanical assurance of motion. When the train finally stopped, he stepped into a station still half collapsed. Children played among the rubble, their laughter echoing through broken arches. From a nearby loudspeaker came an American broadcast, a soft, measured voice speaking of democracy, reconstruction, and the need for machines of peace. Brenner smiled faintly. The words felt right. The war had been a descent into machinery without conscience. Peace, it seemed, would be the ascent through machinery with purpose. The Garand's legacy had followed him home, not in sound this time, but in philosophy. And that legacy, unspoken but enduring, would soon define not only his generation, but the entire rebirth of a nation learning to build again. The final section, Aftermath, slows the rhythm, tracing how memory, machinery, and meaning intertwined long after the rifles fell silent. When the war ended in Europe, the echo of the Garand's metallic rhythm lingered long after the smoke cleared. For men Like General Wilhelm Brenner, the surrender did not feel like silence. It felt like exposure. Gone were the banners and the trumpets. In their place came the hum of American supply trucks and the ordered calm of Allied administration. Brenner found himself processed through a POW camp near Remagen. His medals stripped, his uniform exchanged for coarse cloth. Yet even within that humiliation, something unexpected flickered, the sound of machinery. The Americans kept their camps running with a quiet, methodical precision. Water pumps worked without fail. The kitchens, run by engineers turned cooks, functioned with military efficiency. Trucks arrived on schedule. Food arrived hot. Records were kept clean. It was, in its own way, another battlefield. One fought not with bullets, but with systems. Brenner noticed it immediately. Even their prisons are organized, he wrote in a note later recovered from his effects. It is a discipline without fear. By the time he was transferred to a re-education center in France, Brenner had begun to look at the Garand rifle not as an enemy's weapon, but as a symbol of a world that worked because its parts trusted one another. The Americans used the same mechanical logic in their post-war relief. When he saw crates of medical equipment unloaded for civilian hospitals, stethoscopes, blood pumps, sterilizers, all stamped made in Springfield or Detroit, he realized this was the same industrial philosophy that had defeated him. The precision of their war had become the architecture of their peace. He once told a British interrogator, "Your rifles are better not because they are faster, but because you build them for the man, not the officer." The interrogator smiled. "And what will you build now that the war is over?" Brenner had no answer then. In 1946, he was released and sent back to a Germany still crawling out from under the dust. Stuttgart lay in ruins. Yet amid the rubble, workshops were already clattering to life. The smell of oil and metal returned to the air. Brenner found work as a technical advisor for a reconstruction office, inspecting machine tools salvaged from bombed factories. One day, while examining a battered lathe, he found an American calibration gauge wedged in the drawer, a small tool perfectly balanced, untouched by corrosion. He held it in his palm and thought of Normandy. Over the following years, that simple piece of steel became his talisman. He would carry it from factory to factory, showing apprentices how to align gears or measure tolerances. "Trust this," he would say, tapping the gauge, "not your pride." To him, the gauge and the Garand were of the same philosophy, clarity through precision. The slow rhythm of post-war industry began to replace the sharp tempo of war. But beneath it all, Brenner still heard that same cadence, the steady pulse of mechanical order that had once defined his defeat. By the 1950s, Brenner's name appeared quietly in engineering journals, not for weapons design, but for innovations in industrial tooling and machine safety. His factory outside Stuttgart produced precision components for agricultural engines, printing presses, and medical instruments. When visitors asked about the efficiency of his assembly lines, he would smile and say only, "We learned from the Americans, but we learned differently." In his office, behind the drafting table, hung a small framed photograph taken in Detroit in 1946, a group of German engineers standing before a Ford motor assembly line, eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and admiration. Beneath it, a brass cartridge casing rested in a glass box. He rarely spoke of the war. But sometimes, when an apprentice asked why he designed machines with such careful redundancy, why every lever, every bearing seemed built to survive error, he would pause before answering. Because the world failed once, he'd say, when it forgot what machines were for. To him, the M1 Garand was both symbol and warning. Its perfection had revealed the difference between mastery and obsession. It had shown that progress without humility could become its own form of destruction. In post-war Germany, that distinction mattered deeply. The Allied occupation's industrial rehabilitation program emphasized productivity and transparency, not secrecy. Former engineers like Brenner were invited to lecture on applied efficiency, often using American manufacturing as a benchmark. Records from the Marshall Plan archives show that several such talks, some under assumed names, cited the Garand rifle's reliability as an example of democratic engineering, design that served the soldier, not the regime. One surviving note from Brenner's private papers, dated 1952, reads simply, "A machine must not inspire fear, only confidence." Below it, in faint pencil, he added, "I think that was their secret." That line captures the quiet revelation shared by many former German officers and engineers who had once regarded American manufacturing as crude. They had underestimated what they could not measure, the moral dimension of function. For them, the rifle from Normandy had been a shock not only of power, but of philosophy, a reminder that technology could be humane, that precision could exist without domination. In the years that followed, Brenner's generation helped rebuild a new industrial identity. The factories that rose from the ruins of war bore subtle echoes of the assembly lines they once toured in disbelief. Open floors replaced hidden workshops. Standardized gauges replaced improvisation. Production manuals emphasized worker safety, not speed. It was an evolution shaped not by surrender, but by absorption, a quiet acknowledgement that strength was not control, but cooperation. When Brenner retired in 1962, his final design project was a medical calibration pump. It was, in many ways, a spiritual reversal of the Garand's mechanism, precise, rhythmic, efficient, yet designed to sustain life rather than end it. At the retirement ceremony, his colleagues presented him with a small gift, a walnut plaque engraved with the words, "Aus Genauigkeit kommt Vertrauen." From precision comes trust. He ran his fingers over the wood grain, hearing in memory the echo of the rifle's metallic song. Then he looked at the brass casing on his desk and smiled. The sound that once haunted him now belonged to the past, a single note in a vast symphony of rebuilding. Outside, the world had changed again. The Cold War cast new shadows, and the children of his generation lived among machines that hummed with peacetime energy. Automobiles, radios, and typewriters filled homes once shattered by war. Yet beneath that steady hum, Brenner sensed something enduring, the rhythm that had followed him since Normandy, the pulse of a mechanism that demanded discipline and trust, not awe. Decades later, his story surfaced in an oral history project compiled by the Deutsches Historisches Museum. When asked what single moment had defined his understanding of America, he answered without hesitation, "The first time I heard that rifle fire, because in that sound I understood that their power was not born of brutality, but of belief." The interviewer asked what he meant. Brenner paused, then said, "They built machines for the hands, not the banners." That was how he wanted to be remembered, not as a man conquered, but as one awakened by the clarity of another system's craftsmanship. The M1 Garand had changed the course of his war, and perhaps, in a quieter way, the course of his conscience. And so, in the end, The story of German generals shocked by American rifles is not merely about weaponry. It is about the moment when technology revealed character, when the rhythm of a semi-automatic rifle echoed through the ruins of ideology and became the heartbeat of a different kind of progress. If this story moved you, subscribe to POW Tales, where every silence of war finds its voice again.